London, 1941. A woman raises her arm in a fascist salute at a private gathering in Mayfair. She is surrounded by British aristocrats drinking French champagne while their countrymen die in German bombing raids. The men in this room believe Hitler represents the future of Europe. They pass information to Berlin. Bombing targets, troop movements, political vulnerabilities. They are winning the war from within. The woman toasting the Reich is an MI6 officer. She has spent 14 months becoming the most trusted female voice in British fascist circles. Every conversation in this room will be memorized and delivered to handlers building the case that will destroy this network. She attends their parties. She echoes their hatred. She has watched them celebrate as London burns. Tonight, she will smile at men responsible for British deaths while cataloguing every word they speak. This is the story of how one woman pretended to betray her country in order to save it. Britain in 1940 faced invasion from across the Channel. But the threat was not only external. Within the country, a network of Nazi sympathizers actively assisted the German war effort. They were not saboteurs planting bombs or spies photographing documents. They were something far more dangerous. They were members of the British establishment who believed their country should lose. The British Union of Fascists had been banned at the outbreak of war. Its leader, Oswald Mosley, sat in prison. But the movement's supporters did not disappear. They went underground. They formed private clubs and social circles where loyalty to Hitler could be expressed without fear of prosecution. They gathered in townhouses in Mayfair and country estates in the home counties, raising glasses to German victory, while RAF pilots died defending the skies above them. These were not marginal figures ranting on street corners. They were aristocrats with family connections to military planning. Businessmen whose factories supplied the war effort and who knew production schedules. Members of Parliament who sat on defence committees and heard cabinet discussions. They moved through the highest levels of British society with access that no German agent could ever achieve. MI5 had identified the network's existence but lacked evidence for prosecution. The sympathizers were careful. They never committed their views to paper. They communicated through social gatherings where conversations left no trace. They trusted only people they had known for years, people whose families they had known for generations. Outsiders could not penetrate their world. The intelligence leak was measurable. German bombers struck industrial targets with suspicious accuracy, arriving at precisely the moments when defenses were weakest. U-boats appeared along convoy routes that should have been secret, waiting in positions that suggested advanced knowledge. Fighter squadrons were ambushed by Luftwaffe formations that knew exactly where to find them. Someone was passing detailed operational information to Berlin. The evidence was written in British blood. Infiltrating the network required someone who could move through aristocratic circles without raising suspicion. Someone who could express fascist sympathies with the conviction of a true believer. Someone the targets would never suspect of working for British intelligence because everything about her suggested she belonged to their world. MI6 found her teaching languages at a finishing school in Switzerland. A woman from a good family with no money and exceptional skills. A woman who had spent years watching fascism seduce intelligent people across Europe. A woman who wanted to destroy it from within. The woman they recruited had qualities that made her perfect for the most dangerous role in British intelligence. Eleanor Chadwick was born in 1912 to a family whose social credentials far exceeded their financial circumstances. Her father was a baronet whose gambling had consumed the family fortune before Eleanor reached adolescence. Her mother maintained appearances through sheer determination, ensuring her daughter attended the right schools and knew the right people even as creditors circled the estate. Eleanor learned early that surface and substance were different things entirely. She attended schools on reduced fees arranged through family connections, socializing with girls whose families still had money while hiding the reality of her own situation. She wore handed-down dresses, altered to appear new. She accepted invitations to country houses while making excuses for why visits could never be reciprocated. She became fluent in the performance of belonging to a world that was no longer truly hers. Languages came easily. French by 12, German by 15, Italian by 18. She had an ear for accent and idiom that her teachers described as remarkable. After finishing school, she found employment on the continent as a governess and language tutor to wealthy families who valued English instruction for their children. She worked in Paris, Vienna, and Berlin, moving through circles where politics were discussed with a frankness rarely found in Britain. She understood fascism not as newspaper abstraction, but as lived ideology. She had dined with true believers in Munich who explained with calm certainty why democracy was failing. She had watched intelligent, educated people embrace ideas that should have revolted them. She had seen how the movement seduced through belonging, through purpose, through the promise that history was moving in a direction that would reward the faithful. MI6 identified her through a reference from a British diplomat who had employed her in Berlin in 1937. She had reported concerning conversations to him without being asked, a dinner party where a German official had discussed military production, a social gathering where expansion plans were mentioned with casual confidence. She understood what she was hearing and recognized its significance. She was already thinking like an intelligence officer before anyone recruited her. The approach came in Geneva in early 1940. A man who introduced himself as a cultural attaché, but whose questions suggested other employment. The pitch was direct. Britain needed someone who could pass as a fascist sympathizer. Someone with social credentials that would survive scrutiny. Someone with language skills and psychological resilience. Someone who could sustain a false identity under pressure that would break most people. Eleanor accepted within 48 hours. Her motivations were complex, patriotism certainly, but also something more personal. She had watched fascism seduce people she respected. She wanted to understand how it worked. She wanted to destroy it, using its own methods. Training lasted 3 months. Tradecraft and memorization techniques, the psychology of deception, and the management of fear. But mostly, she studied the target ideology until she could argue for it more convincingly than believers who had never questioned their faith. MI6 needed to insert Eleanor into circles that trusted no outsiders. They found her way in through an unlikely connection. The entry point was social rather than ideological. Eleanor's family connections, though financially ruined, remained socially valid. Her mother's cousin had married a man named Geoffrey Hartwell, whose political sympathies were known to MI6, but against whom no actionable evidence existed. He hosted gatherings where opinions were expressed that would have been dangerous in public. He knew everyone worth knowing in fascist circles. The cover story required no elaborate construction. Eleanor had spent years on the continent and returned disillusioned with democracy. She had witnessed Germany's revival under Hitler, while Britain stagnated under weak leadership. She believed her country's future lay in accommodation rather than a war it could not win. The story worked because it contained enough truth to feel authentic. The cousin arranged an introduction, a dinner party in Belgravia in July 1940, where Eleanor was presented as a young woman recently returned from Switzerland with interesting perspectives on European politics. She expressed carefully calibrated opinions throughout the evening. Criticism of Churchill as a warmonger leading Britain toward destruction. Admiration for German efficiency and national purpose. Skepticism about whether the war could possibly end in anything but defeat. The attendees were cautious, but intrigued. They heard such opinions from their own generation constantly. They rarely heard them from a woman in her 20s. A young woman of good family who had seen the continent firsthand and drawn conclusions that matched their own. They invited her to other gatherings. They tested her opinions over weeks of continued social contact. Eleanor passed every test. She knew which newspapers to praise as clear-eyed and which to condemn as Jewish propaganda. She understood the internal divisions within British fascism and could discuss them with the familiarity of someone who had followed the debates for years. She spoke of Mosley with respect and of Hitler with admiration. Her German was flawless. Her conviction appeared absolute. By autumn 1940, she was attending private gatherings where the pretense of mere political opinion dropped away entirely. The men in these rooms were not conservatives who happened to admire German culture. They were not patriots who disagreed with current strategy. They were active collaborators who wanted Britain to lose the war. They spoke openly about contacts in Berlin. They discussed information they had passed and planned to pass. They toasted German victories while British cities burned. Eleanor had penetrated the outer circle. She was trusted enough to be present. But the men who controlled the network, who managed the actual flow of intelligence to Berlin, remained cautious around her. Reaching them required something more than social acceptance. The men who controlled the network did not trust easily. Eleanor needed to prove her loyalty through more than words. The network's security relied on mutual complicity. Members protected each other because betraying anyone meant exposing themselves. New recruits were not simply welcomed on the strength of their opinions. They were required to compromise themselves, to provide something that could be used against them if they ever wavered. Evidence of treason that bound them to the group more effectively than any oath. Eleanor understood what was being asked when Geoffrey Hartwell explained it over brandy in his study. If she wanted access to the real work, she needed to demonstrate commitment through action. Words were easy. Anyone could express opinions. What had she actually done for the cause? MI6 had prepared for this moment. Eleanor would pass genuine intelligence to the network, low-grade material that appeared valuable but would cause no operational damage. Information that had already been compromised through other channels or was about to become obsolete. Documents impressive enough to establish credibility without costing lives. The first delivery occurred at a garden party in Sussex in September 1940. Eleanor passed a folded document to a man named Reginald Sears, a retired colonel who served as the network's vetter of new recruits. Her hands trembled as she handed it over. The trembling was not entirely performance. The document detailed convoy schedules that had already been changed. If the information reached Berlin, German submarines would search for ships that were no longer there. The network tested the intelligence through channels Eleanor never saw. When it proved accurate enough to seem genuine, her status transformed overnight. She was no longer a sympathizer, expressing opinions. She was a collaborator who had committed treason, one of them in a way that could not be undone. Access expanded rapidly. She attended meetings where actual intelligence was discussed, rather than merely political opinions. She met figures whose names she recognized from MI6 briefings. She listened as men she had been trained to identify discussed bombing targets and convoy routes with the casual confidence of people who believed they were on the winning side. She watched them celebrate raids that killed British civilians, raising glasses to fires she could see from her window. The psychological burden exceeded anything training had prepared her for. She could not break character for weeks at a time. She expressed opinions that revolted her with such conviction that she sometimes struggled to locate her actual beliefs. The mask began to feel like her real face. The hatred she performed began to feel comfortable in her mouth. She drank champagne, while London burned and laughed at jokes about British weakness, and wondered if she was losing the person she had been before. Her handler met her once monthly in locations that changed constantly. A bench in Hyde Park, a pew in an empty church, a gallery in the British Museum. She delivered intelligence verbally, having committed everything to memory. Nothing written, nothing that could be found if she were searched. After each meeting, she returned to the performance, the parties, the salutes, the endless repetition of ideology she despised, delivered with a smile that never wavered. By spring 1941, she had become one of the most trusted figures in the network. They told her things they told no one outside their circle. They assumed her loyalty was beyond question because she had proven it with action. Eleanor had earned their trust. Now she needed to identify the source who was costing British lives. MI6 knew the network was passing intelligence to Berlin. The evidence was written in casualty reports and sunken ships. What they did not know was who controlled the channel. Someone in the network maintained direct communication with German intelligence. Someone was collecting information from the others and transmitting it through methods that had evaded detection for years. Eleanor's mission shifted from general infiltration to specific identification. Find the conduit. Follow it to Berlin. The candidates were numerous. Admiral Sir William Payne, retired from active service, but still connected to former colleagues who discussed operational matters over lunch at his club. Marcus Whitfield, whose engineering factories supplied military components and who knew production schedules that would interest German planners. Harold Ashworth, Member of Parliament for a safe Conservative seat, who sat on a subcommittee reviewing military logistics and transportation. Eleanor worked systematically. She cultivated relationships with each suspect over weeks of careful attention. She steered conversations towards sensitive topics and noted the responses. She listened for the difference between men who repeated rumors and men who possessed actual knowledge. The method was seduction without sex. She made each man feel understood. She asked questions that flattered their sense of importance. She remembered details about their families and interests that made them feel valued. She created intimacy through attention rather than physical contact. The Admiral's information proved outdated. He spoke confidently about naval dispositions that had changed months earlier. He was passing along gossip rather than intelligence. Whitfield knew less than he pretended. His boasting about factory output contained errors that genuine access would have prevented. He was inflating his importance to impress people whose approval he craved. But Ashworth knew things he should not have known. Current things. Operational things. He mentioned convoy routes that had been finalized only days before. He discussed supply movements that were classified at levels far above his committee's clearance. He possessed information that could only come from sources deep within military planning. Eleanor focused her attention. She positioned herself as an admirer of his intellect and judgment. She attended every gathering where he might appear. She created opportunities for private conversation and filled them with flattery, disguised as curiosity. Ashworth responded to the attention. He began confiding in her. He hinted at connections that extended beyond mere sympathy for German politics. He suggested he was performing important work that history would vindicate, work that would be remembered when the proper order was established. Eleanor needed proof, evidence that would stand in court. She needed to catch Harold Ashworth in the act of treason. Getting that proof required Eleanor to take risks that could expose her to both the network and German intelligence. MI6 devised a test. False intelligence would be fed through Ashworth's committee. Information specific enough that if it reached Berlin, its source would be unmistakable. A fictional convoy route through the Irish Sea. A non-existent ammunition depot in Yorkshire. Details precise enough to seem genuine, but fabricated entirely for this operation. If German forces responded to the false intelligence, Ashworth's guilt would be confirmed. But confirmation was not conviction. Courts required evidence. They needed documentation of the act itself. They needed to catch him transmitting or confessing to transmission. Eleanor's role was to create the opportunity. She would arrange a private meeting where Ashworth might be induced to discuss his methods. The meeting would be observed. His words would be recorded. His confession would become the evidence that sent him to the gallows. The location was a flat in Kensington that MI6 had prepared over several weeks. Microphones hidden in the walls. Recording equipment in the basement operated by technicians who would capture every word. Observers positioned in an adjacent room who could intervene if the situation required. Eleanor would be alone with a traitor responsible for British deaths, performing intimacy while intelligence officers listened through the plaster. She invited Ashworth for a private dinner, an intimate evening between two people who shared dangerous convictions and had developed a connection that deserved exploration away from the crowded gatherings where they usually met. He accepted within hours. He had been waiting for this invitation for months. The evening was March 15th, 1942. Eleanor prepared the flat with attention to atmosphere. Candles on the dining table. Wine she knew he preferred. The setting of a romantic encounter that would lower his defenses and loosen his tongue. Ashworth arrived at 8 o'clock precisely. He was nervous but excited. A man in his 60s being invited to dinner by an attractive younger woman who admired him. Eleanor calmed him with conversation, guiding the discussion toward his work, his important contributions, his connections to people who understood that Britain's future lay in accommodation with the inevitable. He wanted to impress her. The wine helped. The intimacy helped more. He began revealing details he had never shared with anyone in the network. How information passed from his committee through a contact at the Spanish embassy, who maintained channels to Berlin. How communications reached German intelligence within days of his providing them. How he had personally delivered intelligence that guided bombing raids against industrial targets. He spoke of British deaths with pride, casualties that proved his value to the cause he served. Every word was captured by the microphones in the walls. Eleanor pushed further. She asked about his handler, about methods and timing, about how he had avoided detection for so long when so many others had been caught. Ashworth answered everything. He was confessing to treason while believing he was seducing a woman who shared his loyalties. At 10:47 p.m., the door opened. MI5 officers entered the flat in a formation that blocked every exit. Ashworth's face collapsed as he processed what was happening. He looked at Eleanor for explanation, for help, for some indication that this was a mistake that she would correct. She offered nothing. Her expression was as empty as a cleared desk. He was arrested on charges of treason. The recordings provided evidence beyond dispute. His trial would be conducted in secret for reasons of national security. His execution would never be reported in newspapers. Eleanor walked out of the flat and did not look back. The man who had killed British citizens through information would never pass intelligence again. The woman who had spent 18 months pretending to share his beliefs stepped into the night and let the mask fall away. Ashworth's arrest was only the beginning. Ashworth's disappearance sent shock waves through the network. One day, he attended gatherings and discussed the future. The next, he was simply gone. No arrest reported in newspapers. No trial announced. He vanished as completely as if he had never existed. Members who had felt protected by their social position suddenly felt exposed. They did not know who had betrayed him. They suspected everyone. MI5 moved before the network could recover. Within weeks, arrests followed across London and the home counties. Admiral Payne was taken from his club. Marcus Whitfield was seized at his factory. Geoffrey Hartwell disappeared from his Belgravia townhouse. A dozen others, whose names Eleanor had provided over 18 months of patient infiltration, found themselves in cells awaiting trials that would never be reported. The prosecutions were conducted in secret. The sentences were severe. Several ended at the gallows. The intelligence channel to Berlin was severed completely. The suspicious accuracy of German operations decreased measurably in the months that followed. Convoys that should have been intercepted arrived safely. Industrial targets that should have been bombed were spared. The war did not end. But British forces stopped dying from betrayal by their own countrymen. Eleanor's cover was extracted before suspicion could fall on her. She simply stopped attending gatherings. A rumour circulated that family illness had called her abroad. The network had larger concerns than one woman's absence. By the time anyone thought to question her disappearance, there was no network left to ask questions. She was debriefed for 3 weeks at a facility in the countryside. Every name, every conversation, every detail of the ideology she had performed for nearly 2 years. Analysts noted her comprehensive recall and her emotional flatness. She delivered intelligence as if reading from files rather than memory. She answered questions about people she had watched celebrate British deaths without any visible reaction. Eleanor received no public recognition. The operation remained classified for decades. The woman who had helped destroy the most dangerous Nazi network in Britain returned to anonymity as if she had never been anyone else. She requested no further operational assignments. MI6 did not argue. The operation's success extended beyond the arrests. The destruction of Ashworth's network eliminated Germany's most valuable intelligence source in Britain. The information flow that had guided Luftwaffe bombers and U-boat wolfpacks for 2 years stopped completely. Berlin's operational planning became measurably less accurate in the months following the arrests. Targets that should have been struck were missed. Convoys that should have been found slipped through undetected. The advantage purchased by years of cultivating British traitors evaporated in weeks. The operation demonstrated that fascist sympathizers in elite circles could be penetrated and destroyed. The assumption that social position provided protection proved false. Men who had believed their family names and club memberships rendered them untouchable discovered otherwise in cells where their titles meant nothing. Other potential collaborators reconsidered their activities. The cost of treason had been demonstrated in terms the aristocracy understood. The methodology Eleanor pioneered informed subsequent operations throughout the war and beyond. Female operatives were deployed in roles that exploited social access rather than technical skills. The recognition that ideology could be performed as convincingly as any other cover expanded what intelligence services believed possible. A woman expressing political opinions attracted less suspicion than a man asking operational questions. Eleanor had proven the concept. Her detailed reporting on the psychology of collaboration provided insights that proved valuable for decades. Understanding why educated and privileged people chose treason helped identify similar vulnerabilities in other contexts. The path from grievance to betrayal followed patterns that could be recognized and exploited. The convictions, though conducted in secret, sent messages through channels that reached their intended audience. Fascist sympathy in aristocratic circles did not disappear entirely. Active collaboration became far rarer. The whispered rumors about what had happened to Ashworth and the others proved more effective than any public prosecution could have been. One woman's 2-year performance had crippled German intelligence operations in Britain at a critical moment in the war. Yet the operation raises questions that resist easy answers. Eleanor Chadwick spent 2 years expressing beliefs that disgusted her. She raised her arm in fascist salutes that mocked everything she valued. She celebrated British deaths with people who wanted her country destroyed. She performed hatred so convincingly that the people she deceived considered her a true believer. The performance required more than words. It required becoming someone else so completely that the real Eleanor nearly disappeared. She later described months where she could not remember what she actually believed. The opinions she performed began to feel natural. The mask fused to her face until she could not tell where it ended, and she began. She saved lives. The intelligence she gathered prevented attacks. The network she helped destroy would have continued costing British lives for years. The utilitarian calculation is unambiguous, but sustained deception exacts a price that mathematics cannot capture. Eleanor never married. She struggled with intimacy for the rest of her life. She had learned too well how to perform connection without feeling it. Every relationship felt like another operation. Every conversation felt like intelligence gathering. After the war, she rarely spoke of her service. When she did, she described it without pride. Necessary work, she called it. Someone had to do it. Was the cost worth the result? Eleanor would have said the question was irrelevant. The work needed doing. She could do it. She did it. What happened to her afterward was simply the price of the ticket. She died in 1987 in a small flat in Dorset, surrounded by books in languages she had learned to lie in. The country she saved never knew her name.